This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of June 12th, 2017. Eagle-eared listeners will probably notice that I've returned back to my old studio setup. I had borrowed some very expensive studio equipment to try to improve the quality of the podcast, and it turns out that the microphones were just a little bit too sensitive, and they were picking up noises from outside, and they were way too bassy, and so we were just not getting the benefit out of it that we would need until comes the point where we completely renovate the studios and really go as far as we need to go there. Anyway, so on to it. The subject for this week's podcast is, can local TV be saved? I mean, that sounds like kind of a dangerous and scary thing to talk about here at the podcast because, of course, we're sponsored by Solid Signal, solidsignal.com, where you can get antennas, satellite television equipment, and all sorts of consumer electronics, just the stuff that you need, just when you need it, at just the right price. Dun-dun-dun. And so maybe we shouldn't be talking about whether or not there is a massive crisis in local television, except that the problem is there is. And just not talking about it on one relatively small podcast isn't going to make it go away, so we may as well just kind of address it. This is something that's not being reported on as much as perhaps it should be, or maybe it is and you're just not paying attention, which is, I'll explain in a minute. But television network ratings were at their worst point literally ever this year, after being at their worst point literally ever last year, and they continue to drop year over year and year over year and year over year, to the extent that the highest rated scripted program in America, and actually the highest rated non-sports program in America, The Big Bang Theory, had a rating of just under 3, meaning that roughly 97% of people were not watching it live or within the first 24 hours. That would be disastrous for that show if it had aired 30 years ago. 30 years ago, you saw programs that sometimes got ratings in the high 20s, low 30s, and now high 2s is considered a huge hit. And this tells you something. This tells you that local television is in trouble. I mean, sure, you can say that's, it's really not looking at the whole picture because you're not looking at DVR and you're not looking at streaming, and all of those things are good for the production companies that make these shows, but they really only matter to the local broadcaster if you watch them either live or within 24 hours of airing. That's how the Nielsen data gets generated, and that Nielsen data is what local television stations use to generate their advertising costs. This is all about advertising on a local level. It's very expensive to operate a television station, and the only ways that they get money are either from local advertisements or from retransmission fees paid by pay TV companies like DirecTV and cable companies. So you start cutting advertising out to that huge degree, and the only avenue left is jacking up rates to cable companies who are already charging their customers way too much, meaning that even more of them will cut the cord, and eventually the whole thing could potentially collapse. Let me back up a second and point out that, for example, if you're watching these same shows, Big Bang Theory or whatever lights you up, on Hulu or on a provider app or some other way, not counting your local channel, it doesn't count to them. They don't get any money for that. As a matter of fact, if you think that companies like ABC and NBC and CBS and Fox are just giving you streaming access out of the goodness of their hearts, you are dead wrong, my friend. In fact, it's hard to see this as anything but an attempt by these major networks to push their own affiliates out of the way so that they can get 100% of the advertising revenue from their customers, you, the viewer. And that whole thing squeezes local television broadcasters who happen to have a large investment in what they're doing, to the extent that it's hard to imagine that they're going to be able to keep up, especially if we talk about sometime in the future trying to force them to upgrade to 4K, for example, or using the already approved scheme by the government where the government's going to pay these channels to relocate so they can clear out some spectrum for cell phone data. Now, let me back up and say that broadcasters had the opportunity to sell back their licenses to the FCC And most of them didn't. Matter of fact, almost all of them didn't, because they were so confident that they were going to just knock it out of the park year after year, continue to make money, and there's something about that doesn't quite make sense. This seems like a massive amount of denial when you realize that ratings have dropped by 90% in 30 years. And so what can they do? Okay, I've painted you a really rough and hard picture, and I've actually gone over 5 minutes already, so I know this is going to be a long podcast. But c'est la vie. Let me talk about what local channels can do before it's too late. And that is to be local channels. If you're a local broadcaster, you have to know that unless you're owned by the network, you can't depend on them. Oh, sure, you may have just sat back and raked in the money back in those old days when Happy Days and Charlie's Angels were keeping you rich. But today, you're not making money from network programming. There's just too many other ways for people to get it. They're not watching it within 24 hours. That's pretty obvious. So think about it. What would actually make you as a local channel worthwhile? And the answer is news. But too many local news stations already have their news programs be entertainment really oriented. It's just nothing but singing, dancing, tap dancing, everybody laughing and smiling. There's not investigative reporting. And I don't want to get too political, but investigative reporting is something that we desperately need today. People need to know what's going on in their local areas. And I know that it's going to seem like, well, that's boring and it's not interesting and whatever. But, this is the stuff that affects you. This is the stuff that affects your kids' schools, your roads, your trash pickup. If there's something going on in your community and there's nobody reporting on it, then you're the one who suffers. It's way too late for newspapers. I think everybody agrees on that. Local newspapers are pretty much done, and there's really not anything that anybody can do to bring them back. The internet killed them. Their own greed more than anything else killed them, because they wanted to charge hundreds and hundreds of dollars for advertising that nobody looked at. Gee, does that sound familiar to anybody, television broadcasters? So what we really have to see from local broadcasters very soon, I think, and what's going to really save them, is a focus on local news, the stuff that people just can't get on the internet, because it's the kind of in-depth reporting that only a well-funded organization like a television station can do. Internet reporting tends to be extremely shallow on the local level because there just isn't money to go out and put those people on the streets. And yet television stations have this extraordinary opportunity to really own local news. The question is, will they do it? For years and years and years, news has been seen as a money loser to television stations, not a money gainer, and I understand that. And it's really hard to have an effective news organization when you're trying to support it directly by commercials. After all, the people who are in the commercials don't really want you poking around their personal business, and I totally get that. But it's important. Why? Local television is important. I'm a big believer in local television, local points of view. I eat local, I shop local, I do everything local when I can, even though I work for a website. That may seem strange to you. But local television is important, and local broadcasters have to work hard, starting now, hopefully actually starting a year ago, to try to bring themselves back to profitability without that big focus on network programming that just is going to leave them out in the cold. Folks, I know this has been a really long podcast, and I probably said zillions of words because I'm talking way too fast this morning, but trust me, I'm glad that you are all the way to the end of it. This is it. And I thank you for your patience. We'll see you next week on the podcast with a regularly sized, normal length show.